Morning all, Oscar here, and a quick video on agriculture and emissions policy, and a little primer for everyone. Just a quick 101. There's a great line from a TV series I've been watching recently, which says, "We are at a crisis. The distance between what is known to be true and what is said has turned into an abyss." It's about a science fiction dictatorship, that particular line. Got to be honest, it's not far off on the ag and net zero policy debate here, because there is some awfully big, nonsensical, counterfactual, unjustified claims being made by certain people and certain political organisations. And a lot of it, friends, is bullshit. These are liars who are lying to you. And I just want to make sure that everyone kind of gets what the realities are. I've had 21 years of policy experience, either as a professional lobbyist or staff member with a bunch of different ag industry groups. I've also been a farmer and a volunteer member of different farming organisations. I've been a research fellow, I've been a project manager, and I've been a consultant on environmental policies as well. So I've done a fair bit on this, and over the years, I've gathered a fair bit of information, and I just wanted to share that information with you as I understand what is happening right now in net zero as it applies to agriculture in the Australian policy sense. So here we go. First thing, the Australian government many, many years ago made a decision to separate my agricultural business, so my cattle, my diesel, my fertilizer use, those emissions which can add by human activity, add to the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. Those things are separated from the landscape, right? So the trees here, some of which are pretty young, the grass, the vegetation here that's growing pretty well and hasn't been overgrazed, that is all progressively, slowly over the decades, adding a little bit of carbon to our ecosystem, and that is creating an offset and a sink. Okay, so this is called LULUCF, right? This stuff here. But if we go over to the paddocks or go over to where the cattle are, the agricultural stuff is in the ag sector. So ag and land were separated, and that was a deliberate choice by the Australian government. Other jurisdictions, other models that they could have chosen, the coalition government could have chosen, were rejected. So that means that the agricultural offsets from your agricultural lands aren't counted in with the agricultural emissions sector. It's two separate sectors, two different categories. Now, why that would have been done by a coalition federal government many, many years ago still eludes me. But the most likely explanation was that all the freebie carbon credits that the land use sector creates could then be given to other sectors. In other words, the preferred child gets a little prize at the expense of the not so preferred child. So mining in particular has benefited from those free carbon credits, but really all sectors outside of agriculture in the Australian economy have benefited. If you understand the reasons why previous governments could say things like, "We are meeting Kyoto at a canter," that was entirely due to farmers, folks. That was entirely due to agricultural land management. None of that came from any other sector. And there's the farce of this thing. Not only is agriculture providing nearly all of the offsets through the LULUCF sector, we're also the only sector that has reduced emissions while increasing production. Right, so our emissions intensity consistently over the last 30 years has been reducing. We are creating more food with less emissions every single year, because that's just better practice and better business. We don't need government to intervene to put a tax on us or a tariff or anything like that to tell us this is the better way of doing it, because agriculture and farmers try to be more efficient, and that efficiency creates lower emissions, right? So that's the reality of the way Australia's annual emissions reporting has been done for good on 30 years, right? We're about 14% on average of the nation's total emissions using the existing environmental accounting methodologies. The issue there is that we're at least 7 to 8% of the nation's sinks. So the net is maybe 6, maybe 7% of the nation's emissions coming from agriculture. That's using these existing full CAM models and the emissions factors that are currently applied. Now, if you want a good conspiracy theory, go and do some of the research on this. And by that, I mean, don't look up dodgy websites where people talk shit. Go and look up peer-reviewed scientific papers where technical measurements, spectrometry analysis, laser spectrometry analysis, atmospheric sampling processes are done. Go and look these things up. And just look up, is agriculture's emissions reporting accurate or not? And the answer is, it's been overestimated. The emissions factors, which apply under the Australian government's choices on those emissions reporting, agriculture has been way overrepresented for a very long time. And more science from MLAs, DPIs, and other research agencies is proving, piece by piece, that those emissions have been overestimated. Even the IPCC has put that in there as well. So agriculture's emissions tend to be overestimated. One sector, though, underestimates by a even bigger margin, frankly, all of its emissions. And that's our friends in the gas and coal industry. Gas and coal put out way more fucking methane and way more other highly greenhouse gas causing atmospheric contaminants. They probably are 50% underreported. The science opinions vary. Minimum range 30% under, so we should be adding a third more emissions to those sectors. But probably at least 50%. There's some work showing it's 3 or 4 times though, so 300 or 400%. So, take your pick of the science, but there's plenty of peer-reviewed scientific information out there showing that agriculture's attribution needs to come down, but we're already doing a good job by bringing it down. But the coal and gas industries, well, they're underestimating, and it's not like they don't have pretty crash-hot lobbyists. I mean, agriculture had to employ people like me, the cheapened Timu lobbyists. The mining sector employs the best lobbyists in Australia and has the best political dinners and gets the best post-political careers. And so, of course, the mining sector has a better influence and is able to just put its little fingers on the scale a little bit and have things like the amount of fugitive emissions coming from its operations being just underestimated a little bit there. Of course they do. That is the way that this works in Australia. So, ag is not the villain. Ag is the one that's providing offsets for the last 30 years, and it's at least 7 to 8% of the total emissions in this country being offset by agriculture specifically. And that number could be much higher. It could be up to 13 or 14%. The ag sector has had an over-reporting of its emissions because of the standards and technical standards and National Greenhouse Gas Inventory and full CAM factors being tipped a little too high. Just put a little bit more blame on agriculture. Whereas the real villains in this picture, the coal and gas industries, those motherfuckers have been pushing their fingers down on the scales to get them a much lower debt. They also get guarantees and exemptions and discounts. So gas industry gets about 25% on average, coal up to 30, but somewhere around 13 to 30% discounts on their safeguard offsets. So that's where if you emit over 100,000 tonnes of CO2e, the safeguard is triggered. That's essentially when they have to buy carbon credits, ACCUs, their burdens are significantly reduced. They get a discount. No one else in the economy does, but coal and gas does. So that's where we're at. One sector is bleeding out agriculture a little bit, getting some freebie credits, getting some little transfer of offsets, having their own emissions underestimated while ours are overestimated. I don't think there's a sensible scientific or political analyst in the country who would argue that anything that I've just said is inaccurate, unless they worked for the aforementioned coal and gas industry. And if you hear a politician who argues against that, then you might have to make assumptions about who they actually do work for. Are they representing farmers, or are they representing some of these other industries and putting their interests above yours? Now, Australia has signed up to the Paris Agreement, like we had with Kyoto, that we met at Akana. Kyoto 1 and 2, we signed up to, and those goals were achieved, again, largely because of the Australia Clause and the actions of Australian farmers. But we're not going to be able to do that. The biophysical tap has run dry, essentially. We can't rely on the land use sector to provide offsets for the rest of the economy, not on Paris. So it's starting to get real. The landscape is tapped out in a lot of ways. The impacts that we're already seeing of climate change, that increased warming, is already changing the capacity of Australian landscapes to store carbon. So both in terms of warming of the soil, greater periods of dryness, more extreme weather events in terms of wet, dry cycles, more extreme floods, longer and worse droughts. All of these things are changing the landscape's ability to sequester carbon or remove other greenhouse gases. So that is a trick that the Australian government is not going to be able to play again, not going forward. So farmers won't be wearing the cost of Paris because we simply don't have the biophysical capacity in our landscapes to do that. The only way that the obligations from the other sectors could be paid by agriculture would be if you see what's been happening in Western Australia, or in Delegate in New South Wales, and a few other places around the country, where some of these larger emitters, say Woodside, but I believe Santos is stepping into that a little bit now, any of these larger, very high emitting gas or coal industry players, they just buy whole farms, or in some cases whole districts, buy up everything, plant it to trees. They get 30 years of carbon credit generation under ACCU methodologies about revegetation. They can do that for 30 years. Their plan is to sell it in year 28. And then for the next, say, 72 years, someone else is going to have to pay for the management. And we know what happens when you don't really manage active landscapes too well. I mean, let's be honest, I've got a few bits of saltbush here, plenty of native grasses, but there's a bit of cactus that needs managing. It always happens in Australian landscapes. It costs a lot to manage Australian landscapes. Well, these fossil fuel companies are planning for the next 72 years to let someone else pay for that, because they'll have gathered their carbon credits in that first 30 years of the methodology and then fucked off and let someone else pay for the management of weeds and pests and all those other things and fire risks. So look, but that's just the way those companies work, making sure that they don't get in there and cause themselves to have to pay for the long-term damage of what they've been doing. They do that with their oil wells, they do that with their coal mines. That is their objective. They're trying to optimize their profits and pass the costs on to someone else, preferably the taxpayer. So the offsets in vegetation processes, that's going to be a really big policy issue for agriculture to work out what we do on there. We need protections. You cannot have whole districts that are already well developed and producing a lot of food for Australians and for the world, then getting turned into unmanaged monocultures of trees for a temporary, one generation hit of carbon credits, and then seeing it locked up for the next 70 years after that. So it's there for 100 years being fucked. This is not how you manage the landscape successfully, and we can't let it happen. We have to fight this one, agriculture. But that's not to blame net zero for this stuff, because you're an idiot if you think you are. Like, let's just be clear. When it comes to climate change, we have international agreements in place. Net zero is a requirement and a target for all nations under the Paris Agreement. And that's because the science fucking says so, guys. You cannot continue to do what we are doing to the atmosphere as a planetary superspecies. If you fucking keep doing that, you screw the planet. Like, this is not about, is it going to happen? It's about how fucked we will let things get, right? Will you put out the fire before it spreads from your kitchen counter to the rest of the ventures in your kitchen? Or will you put the fire out, it's taken the kitchen, will you put it out before it spreads into the living room and the kids' bedrooms? Or will you just simply let it burn down and take the whole fucking house, right? We are talking the degrees by which we can minimize damage at a global level in global cooperation with all nations meeting net zero. Now, eventually is the problem part. Yep, the woke have fucked up pretty badly by putting the level of development, the wealth, into these agreements. They have given countries like China too long. China probably is aiming for 2060 or 2070 net zero. It's not terrible, but some poorer countries that are trying to industrialize using coal-fired power. I mean, sorry guys, you just don't get to do that. Fuck you. You don't get that option because the planet cannot survive it if you do. If you industrialized Africa and the subcontinent region to the same degree that we in the West have and that China is now, you don't have a viable planet. You lose so many million hectares of farming country. You lose so many species. You have so many millions, if not billions, displaced from their homes because of food shortages. If you see a runaway climate impact of warming globally at an average over 5 or 6 degrees, which is very possible under all of these models, then you have fucked your society. Western society does not survive a 5 or 6 degree warming. And we're well on our way to doing that. So, it's currently costing, on average, the Australian farmer around $30,000 a year. And that's because of the increased variability of climate and those increased severity of climate actions. On average, across Australia, each farm, it's costing about 30 to 40 grand a year. And that's quantified very conservatively by ABARES. And if you've been in a 2 or 3 year drought, when such things have never occurred in the last 100 years, or in fact, when we had it a few years ago, the climate science analysis, which included some soil core testing and some research done by some various academic bodies around the place, they estimated that our drought was probably the worst in 500 years. So there hadn't been a drought that severe in 500 years, which matched up to the fact that many 200 to 300-year-old trees were just dying from lack of moisture. They had never seen that before in the couple of hundred years that they'd been alive. We are seeing more severe weather events. That is having a greater impact on food stability, food security, and the ability of farmers to operate profitably in this landscape. There is no doubt on that, okay? This is one of those things where the confidence levels and the assurances of the modelling and of the data are so consistent that there is not a debate on does climate change hurt agriculture. It fucking does. The question is, how bad are we going to let it go to, right? If our and other international leaders, governments, step back from their existing commitments on Paris, and Paris does necessitate net zero for every country eventually, if we don't stick to that goal, then a big chunk of Australian agriculture is fucked for multiple generations. That will be the moral test of our time. If you want something to motivate you, if you're a conservative, aggressive kind of person whose policy is very masculine and nationalist, good for you. I'm a bit that way myself. Just think about both people. Like, the destabilization of agriculture in other parts of the world is going to cause mass food shortages. There is almost no doubt about that. It is coming. And resultant displacement of people will make this fucking little "we stop the boats" bullshit from a few years ago look like a doddle. Back then, we had a few thousand boat people arriving in Australia, and not even mostly on the mainland. The US Department of Defense has reports which are projecting hundreds of millions because of the lack of food security due to those extreme events, hundreds of millions of migrants a year right across the planet, many of whom are in Southeast Asia. Now, look, I trust the innovation of a farmer. I do it myself. See other farmers, we're pretty innovative. You take a few 100 million people in the developing world, farmers, and see their livelihoods wiped out and their families starving. Yeah, they're going to find a way to move. It might be by land. I wouldn't back down by saying that we could have tens of millions of climate refugees landing on Australian shores within the next 50 years. And it will be worse the less action we and other economies and countries around the world take. We lost our mind as a country when 10,000 showed up. If 10 million showed up, how the fuck do we handle that? And that is very much on the cards. I mean, this is US Department of Defense projecting these numbers, not some lefty, hippie, greeny, softy, peace and mung beans loving group. This is the US Department of Defense, the most feared military in the whole fucking history of the planet. They are the ones who are analysing the situation and saying, we've got a big problem. Geopolitical instability is going to be massive due to food insecurity caused by this increased climate variability and the severity of extreme events. And that in turn is directly being caused by the emissions that we are making today, okay? So you've got to understand, this is not fucking leftist propaganda. This is some very right-wing groups. I mean, we've got the IMF, the World Banks. These guys destroyed communism through financial and market activity, showing the superiority of capitalism. These motherfuckers are not left-wing hippies. They're business interest groups, very much focused on capitalism. And they're making the same warnings. The only ones who aren't making these warnings are those people who have a vested interest in Australia's fossil fuel industries. I mean, I'm sorry, that's as simple as it comes down to. If you see someone espousing coal and talking down the veracity of the Paris Agreement, then you just fucking know that they're compromised in one way or another. Now, they might be a useful idiot who's just echoing one of their leaders' views. That's possible. But the majority of those leaders have got something in the pocket happening here, folks. They've either got jobs, or they've taken political donations, or they've got more little influences and networks by pushing these angles. These are not honest people. These are people who are essentially being paid to say things. And if you swallow that trash, then you, unfortunately, will be assisting companies that are hurting your long-term interests. Now, it mightn't be you. You may not be heavily impacted by climate change. It might be 2, 3, 4, 6 generations down the line. But I've got to be honest, if you're not thinking about that sort of stuff and putting your moral cap on going, yeah, I wouldn't want to fuck things up for my grandchildren, if you're not in that view of trying to think for the future, well, fuck you. You're not really a farmer. You're not really someone who's representing agriculture. You're a short-term get-quitch and fuck-off person. Well, that's fine. Go fuck off. Ultimately, the only responsible and moral, ethical position that any farmer can take is to safeguard the long-term future and interests of their land and of future generations to farm on that land. If you're not doing that, I'm sorry, you are a moral vacuum. If someone hurt my kids, I've got to be honest, I'm going to put them down. I'm going to be not very tolerant of someone who's trying to hurt our children. And if someone's trying to hurt our children's interests or the assets that feed and create the businesses for our future children as future farmers, got to be honest, folks, you're not going to tolerate that shit. You're going to go pretty hard on that, right? Why would you indulge the wealth creation of other people off farm in those other sectors, or the enrichment of a few pretty sketchy politicians who seem to only be able to raise issues, create mistruths and bullshit? That seems to be their main skill, but they can do that for, and as a paid spokesman for, certain interests. Why would you support that kind of person? That's not who farmers are. We're smarter than that, and we're more ethical than that, right? Okay, so let's get to the crunch, though. I'm saving the best till last, but what is net zero policy when it comes to agriculture? Understand that farmer groups and farmer lobby groups aren't stupid, and we've been pushing pretty hard. So New South Wales Farmers and the National Farmers Federation put forward some policy a few years ago. I was partly involved in some of the development of that. That policy has caveats, and it basically says that farmer groups support net zero on the basis of key caveats being met. If you want to know more, jump onto the NFF website and look up net zero, or the New South Wales Farmers website, and the same thing there. But if you want to know these things, have a look and see what's the reasoning there. There's a bunch of reasons why agriculture needs to do it. It's not just the biophysical science and realities of what's coming over the next century. There's also very important trade and economic reasons. But the important thing is we have a support for net zero that has caveats in it. And I need to say something really, really important. Mark the time here. It's 25 minutes now, but 25 minutes in, I've finally come to the key point. And that is this. Agriculture is the one sector in the economy that's not expected to be net zero. Because we've already talked about this, but the interactions on my farm between soil, biology, fertilizer, and other inputs inherently means, like literally the way the accounting systems are designed and act, means that agriculture can't be net zero because we are a biological process, because our crops growing, our cattle growing, our livestock operating around in a biological function. That means we will not be net zero, and we are not expected. We're the only sector that is not expected to be net zero. The IPCC says it multiple times that agriculture is a priority for global food security, and that agriculture is not expected to be net zero before 2100. Okay, we're talking 75 years from now before there could be any expectations of net zero placed on agriculture. And as we talked about earlier, because of the landscape function and the way landscapes are being affected by climate change, we know that there's less capacity for agricultural landscapes to store and sequester carbon. So in other words, every good piece of science and policy says, yeah, agriculture, you're okay. You're doing really well over the last 30 years. You've done a huge job over the last 30 years, but we can't expect more from you. And we know that you can't be net zero, right? The NFF policy and the New South Wales Farmers Policy is not about agricultural net zero. It's about an economy-wide net zero. Why is that policy in place? Because those Paris targets and objectives have to be met. But we know that agriculture won't be the main sector having to do the lifting this time around, because it biophysically can't be the main sector doing that, right? Anyone who's arguing against net zero right now is arguing against the idea that other sectors have to start finally, after 30 years, pull their finger out of their ass and do their own fucking work. Okay? Now, one of the things about net zero is it is a legislative process, right? So it had bipartisan support federally. It's in the legislation requires the government of the day to develop individual sectoral plans. Okay? So there is an ag sector plan being drawn up right now by Minister Bowen and Minister Collins, the ag and the emissions environment ministers. Okay, so Bowen and Collins have made commitments to the Australian farming community, and they need to be really, really clearly understood. So here's the key part. The ALP government has done one really good thing where they have committed to 0% sectoral target reductions for agriculture. So just to explain that, every single sector under legislation has to have a plan developed for them where that sector will have to be given a target. This is how much you have to reduce. It's a set percentage target in the legislation. And if those sectors don't meet those obligations, then things like taxes could be put upon them. Okay? So why is agriculture in such a unique position? We have a sectoral target of zero coming up. Okay, that means no beef tax. That means no methane tax. That means no fertilizer tax. That means all of the other policy impediments and stupid policies that have been put out by some white governments around the world, particularly Europe and New Zealand. None of that is coming here in Australia, because the 0% emissions target that is about to be publicised and legislated by this government guarantees immunity from all of those negative policy issues. And if you don't understand that, you need to, because a 0% target is the biggest policy win for Australian agriculture in about a generation. You need to understand that if we step away from net zero now and risk and basically end that 0% target, we have just thrown away the opportunity of a generation in terms of policy. Okay, so let's be clear again. 0% emissions reduction target for the agricultural sector. That is coming out this year. That means other sectors are going to have to pay and act and deal with net zero. But agriculture, because of our massive contributions in the past and our continuing progress to reduce emissions, we don't get legislated. We don't get beef taxes. We don't get increasing costs placed upon ourselves. And that is vitally important. And as a farmer, you need to understand the advantage that we have now. And you also need to understand that throwing away net zero, choosing as an ag sector to not support net zero, is the biggest own goal that we could possibly create. Because I guarantee you, when the coalition comes into government again, probably in 6 years' time or maybe longer, they will still have to create a legislated net zero sectoral plan. And I tell you what, folks, we'll be very fucking lucky if we ever get 0% in there again, including under an LNP government. So let's just think about it. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to lock in a 0% emissions reduction target for agriculture under the sectoral plan. Let's not be fucking stupid. Let's think about it, and let's get ourselves a competitive advantage, not only against other sectors in the economy. You know, let's be honest, we will be richer versus other sectors being poorer under these emissions sectoral plans, right? But more importantly, we're getting a competitive advantage over the other countries with whom we compete on global markets. You know, we export 70% of our produce. If we got a cost competitive disadvantage, like a beef tax or an emissions tax on agriculture, we're not going to be able to export competitively to the rest of the world. You know, agriculture will shut down. But if we don't have a competitive disadvantage, if we can compete, obviously we're paying ridiculously high wages and we've got a whole bunch of other costs that are unnecessarily high. But if we can not have to go to the global marketplace with a methane tax or a beef tax or an emissions tax put on ourselves, well, then we can continue to be competitively advantaged in that global marketplace, and we can continue to do what we've been doing. We throw all of that away if we abandon net zero. So I need everyone to think about this very hard. Please do not trust me. Please do not just take it as read. Please go and read the various reports, the various publications from the Australian government, from other governments, from other farm groups, from other NGOs. Go and do your research. Look at the academic papers. Please have a very good think. Because the dumb and easy thing would be to say something stupid like, yeah, fuck net zero, it's going to create taxes for farmers. Well, it fucking won't unless you stuff it up and create a problem for yourselves and for future generations in agricultural policy. So, good luck. Have a think. Don't fuck it up. Be strategic, be smart, and represent agriculture, your industry, and its long-term future. And think about what all this will mean for your grandchildren when they're running their farms. Because I can tell you what, folks, if we don't take that long-term view and we act emotionally and without considering things in a strategic context, we are at a point where we could very easily fuck up agriculture for the next generation or two, and then climate change will do the rest for the next 3 or 4. Thanks, folks.